Hello, we're live. It's told us that we're live.
Wow.
Yeah. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people here, and it's good that you're getting stuck in the chat. So please use the chat, say hello to each other, share your Twitter handle, ask questions, make comments. We're going to share some reading as we go through the evening as well. So if you don't want to listen to us, you can just read what we've written instead. But yeah, it's brilliant. Are we going to give it a minute, Lou, for other people to join?
I think that makes sense. So if you've got any early questions that you want to ask us, we can always say, if we're not, we can always tell you if we're going to keep our powder dry. But as ever with me in UK, we're not at all sure where this is going to go, which is what's so exciting about it.
It is, and I was just saying before we went live that I first wrote the blog that I'm going to share with you tonight about anti-fascist education nearly 5 years ago. So it shows how long I've been thinking about this. So it's really nice to kind of open things to the world a little bit tonight and hear what other people have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to see you, Mike, to see you, Shuki. Hi, Julian. Lovely to meet you. Hello, Arthur. Katia. Actually, I'm an early bird, so this is past my bedtime too. Good evening, Stuart. Jodie and Amber here from Solidarity Spaces, and lovely to meet Emma. Anna, hello. I'll see you in a few weeks. And Joe, of course, wonderful that you're here, and you too, Lucy. Elizabeth, I see, and Philippa, and also Liz. Great stuff. Thank you so much for coming along. Excellent.
Philippa's in New Zealand, so I think she's having a breakfast just as we're about to have gin and tonic. So that's really nice.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This isn't actually a gin and tonic. I have done that before, but I'm not doing it tonight.
Yeah, no, me neither. I want my wits about me. Hello, Rivet Thistle. Hello, Mel. Teachers of Tomorrow. Brilliant, and thanks for tweeting us earlier. Beth, it's really great to see you. Elena too, and Hina's here. Wonderful. Kate, hello. Natasha. Peter Venables, how brilliant. Thank you for coming. Hi, Petronelle. Hi, Pam. And Cake Tin Cupcake. Fantastic. That sounds nice. I've got a friend on Twitter who's Katie Cupcake, so I'm not sure if that's the same person.
I don't know if Francesca's here tonight, but it's Gramsci's birthday, I think. So we should have a little drink for Gramsci, as it's a little bit of an influence, I think, on what we're going to say tonight. And I've actually pronounced it correctly for the first time in my life.
Excellent.
I'm really proud of myself. I had to think about it.
I'm so glad you said that, because I would have said it wrong. So that is great. Barbara, wonderful. Thank you. And Cheryl's here as well, which is wonderful. And Philippa, congratulations. You deserve a small hangover after your celebrations. Oh, Bally's here. Hello, Bally. How lovely. How lovely to not see you, but it's really nice to know that you're here. Wow,
John
well, that's
here, but he hasn't. Yeah, John's not got the chat working, but John Diamond is here. So hello to John.
Brilliant. Hiya, John. And hiya, Nick. Rabbit hole. I love that. You like a rabbit hole, don't you, Kay? As long as it's not under the fence and an escape for Harry.
Yes, I haven't got her here with me tonight, but she's here in spirit.
Well, that seems like a really nice audience.
It does. Shall we begin?
Let's begin. Hi, Lisa.
You're just going to keep saying hello to people, though, aren't you?
I'm going to stop now. I'm going to stop saying hello. I'm going to stop.
Okay, so a very warm welcome and a big thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I mentioned this a few minutes ago, but if you just joined us, then please do say hello in the chat, introduce yourself, use that. We love back channels, so do use the chat to comment and discuss things as we go through the next hour, and ask us questions. We'll keep an eye on what you're saying in there and respond. We're going to share some reading that you can look at now, or you can share and look at afterwards. And if you're tweeting at the same time, if you're multitasking, you might want to use the hashtag that I think Lou put in the chat. You might want to maybe put it in again, Lou. She has there. Hashtag posthuman pedagogies. We haven't called it anti-fascist pedagogies because we all know what happens on Twitter when we mention it, which is a real shame, but it's a reality. So we're going to use that. But I think we're hoping perhaps to do more of these kind of conversations, which will always have a post-human angle to them. So hopefully that'll be a theme for future weeks. So my name's Kay Sidebottom. I'm a lecturer in education and childhood at Leeds Beckett University. Been interested in anti-fascist work and anti-fascist education for quite a number of years now, but critical pedagogy is also my thing, post-human thinking as well. So Lou, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am a nomad quite deliberately. That's the title that I choose for myself, mainly working in English further education, in professional learning, with a particular interest in community education. And I was a community worker before I was an educator. Well, I was an educator as a community worker. So I'm really interested in working across those sort of public sector silos that we have. And a big part of my practice is the thinking environment, which we're going to be talking about tonight.
Thank you very much. So by way of introduction, I'm going to just read through quite a summary of a blog that I actually started writing a few years ago now on the subject of anti-fascist pedagogy. And I've updated it a little bit since, but the ideas are still the same. I'm just going to post the link to it. Oh. Hopefully that's worked, and sorry for the feedback there. Has that come through, Lou, in the chat? Might not have done.
Not yet. Okay,
don't worry. I'll try again in a minute, but I'm going to read it out and just to give you a gist of kind of the background to this, the context in terms of what we've been thinking about. So the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill has been making its way through our political system. New legislation that's essentially curtailing the ability to protest in the UK. Despite vociferous condemnation on Twitter, the media is suspiciously quiet on the subject. Cronyism in politics is being exposed at new levels on an almost daily basis, yet voter indications reveal increasing level of support for the Conservative Party. Meanwhile, our education system sees a heightened focus on behaviour, silence and obedience, with children routinely disciplined for minor hair and uniform infringements. To cry fascism at this point may chime with many, but will also be roundly condemned by those wanting clear definitions and separations from Nazism and fascist movements of the past. However, Timothy Snyder calls us not to get tied up in semantics, but to look instead for fascist patterns so that we can learn from history and prevent the normalisation of fascist tendencies. While right-wing extremism may be out there in the Charlottesville marches, Trumpism, and echoed in the words of Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson, it's important to remember that it's also insidious. It creeps into lives and becomes normalised in our language and behaviours. As Umberto Eco wrote in Fascism, fascism can come back under the most innocent of disguises. Our duty is to uncover it and to point our finger at any of its new instances every day in every part of the world. According to Merriam-Webster, fascism is, quote, a political philosophy, movement or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual and that stands for a centralised autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. Eco suggests a list of features that are typical of what he calls fascism or eternal fascism. As he states, these features cannot be organised into a system. Many of them contradict each other and are also typical of other kinds of despotism or fanaticism. But it is enough that one of them be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. The first principle that fascism derives from individual or social frustration is enough in itself to set alarm bells ringing. 4 other key features are Number one, the cult of tradition, the desire to return to a better age and a fear of modernism. Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message. And it should be noted at this point that the first thing that fascist states sees is the curriculum. Number two, irrationalism and the promotion of action over thought, a distrust of the intellectual world. Number three, fear of difference. Fascism is racist by definition. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Number four, the fostering of a spirit of war, heroism, and machismo. Since both permanent war and heroism are difficult games to play, the fascist transfers his will to power, to sexual matters. This is the origin of machismo, which implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. We should also pay heed to Lawrence Britt's 14 signs of fascism, which include cronyism, corruption, the suppression of organised labour and trade unions, obsession with national security, and identification of scapegoats as a unifying cause. As an educator, I therefore wonder, what might an anti-fascist curriculum that takes account of warning signs such as echoes look like? How can we be the people that point our finger at new instances of fascism? And how might we best do this? In our zeal to share this thinking, how do we avoid our own love of power? How do we avoid dictating the behaviour of teachers and instead act as a stimulus that has the potential not to make large-scale change, but to spark a line of flights that disrupts the status quo? So that was my thinking a few years ago, and it remains very current and very live in me. So Lou, having heard all of that, I'm really interested to hear, and I think for people in the room who perhaps don't know so much about the thinking environment, can you tell us first of all what that is to start with, and then perhaps how it might relate and how it might be a tool that can be employed in an anti-fascist education?
So thank you, Kay, for that. That was a great introduction. And what I'm going to describe to you now will seem a really small thing. Yet its impact is huge. And to be honest, I've been learning, practicing a thinking environment for 25 years now, and I've learned more about it in the last year of relating to people online than I have in the previous 24. So it's incredibly powerful and getting a real traction in further education. It comes from the work of a woman called Nancy Klein, who is still alive. I trained with her, and she began to observe in the 1970s what seemed to be the conditions for people thinking better and thinking better together. And she developed a set of processes which she called the thinking environment. And she first published about them in 1999. So she'd been working in this way for a long time, and I had began my training maybe 5 years before that date. Nancy's latest book came out last year at the end of October. And in it, it's called The Promise That Changes Everything. And that promise is not to interrupt. And this in the scope that you've given us, Kay, and the rise of fascism in the world in different forms, this seems like such a tiny thing, doesn't it? To make that promise not to interrupt someone. But at the heart of it is independent thinking and creating the conditions for independent thinking. It's Gramsci's birthday today, and he talked about organic intellectuals and philosophers of praxis. And it seems to me that the thinking environment offers us more than a pedagogy, really, because it is not just about a classroom experience. It's about what we do in meetings, when we are groups together, when we are one-to-one, to follow a simple set of rules which do what we say we want in education. Because what we say we want in education is people to think independently. And then we set about creating systems, processes, pedagogies, hierarchies, silos, assumptions, biases that do everything to prevent that independent thinking, even as we say that's what we're doing. So there's a huge rhetoric gap. What Nancy asks us in The Promise That Changes Everything, she says, we have a decision to make. And that decision is that when we are thinking, the only way that we can allow ourselves to think independently is to put to one side our cares about what people think about us and what people think about what we say. And when we are listening to generate that thinking, so a sort of generative level of attention, the promise we make to ourselves is to ensure that what the thinker is thinking is more important than anything we could ever say at that minute. There is nothing we can interrupt that thinking with that we know for certain could be better in terms of what they need than what they're going to think themselves, because we don't know what they're going to think and they don't know that yet. And the minute we start interrupting, whether that's verbally or, all the sort of non-verbal cues, they're going to get derailed and that moment is lost. And that sounds easy, but it's not easy. If it was easy, we'd be doing it all the time. And what holds it together is this is a very values-based process. So there are a set of 10 values or components of a thinking environment, and we hold them in place as facilitators of any thinking environment experience through rules like role, rank, and ego left at the door. We're in there equal as thinkers. And this creates a culture of trust. It creates a culture of equality. It has to be enforced. Cultures develop where actually people go, if somebody comes in with their ego, it starts to be, it's a really different space. The not interrupting is really important. And also the equality of time is an incredibly important thing. And we do not advise, because advice is always about inequity. We may have a piece of information that's going to be helpful, but advice is not the thing. So from this really simple set of processes, which are harder than they look to facilitate, if I'm honest, to be disciplined and rigorous, what I'm observing is developing cultures which are anti-competitive, which is essential, and where teachers I work with in professional learning on the whole, but also I've done this work with trustees of community organisations, lots of different groups. And what happens is that culture of trust has this, it has a practice of care, it has a real liberating influence on people's organizational cultures, because then they take these cultures out into organizations. And in professional learning, I think in FE we're turning that on its head, because instead of the sort of drive-by, or as my friend Sammy calls it, sheep dip CPD, the expert, what's happening is we, lots of us, are opening up spaces where educators are coming together, thinking independently together. They find their own ways to equity, to equitable practice, to anti-competitive practice, and to practices of joy and openness and care. And that is changing organisations. Now, that's very different to marching on Capitol Hill or down at Whitehall. But as an anti-fascist practice, I think it has incredible power, because what interested me, Kay, in what you said was that it enables us to scrutinise the hold that power has on us and to unpick it. And once you've been in that space, it really makes it a lot harder to go out and oppress somebody else. So that was a bit of a sort of whistle stop run through. So, I'll keep an eye on and see what comments and questions are coming up as well. But what do you think?
Yeah, that's a really helpful scene setting, I think. So I was thinking this morning that it's 10 years actually, almost to the day, that I first experienced the thinking environment at Northern College. And it was interesting when I think back to my own resistance to that practice initially. And I think many people will feel that, won't they? They'll have said to you that they feel quite defensive, that there's a vulnerability element to it that can be very challenging. There's also the difficulty sometimes in being asked what you think when you've never been asked that question before. And when I think about schooling at the moment, and I think perhaps about my own children, you know, and I might say to them, oh, what do you think about this? And it's kind of, why are you asking me that? You know, what does it matter? Or I've never been in a position where I've been asked to particularly think for myself. And that can be really frightening, I think, actually. And I guess as a practitioner, one of the things I quite often forget is how far away people are because they haven't experienced that before. And we've seen it, haven't we, in a classroom where we've said, let's do a thinking round, which is basically a turn-taking exercise when everyone has the opportunity to respond to a question. And it's like the floodgates open and people don't know when to stop because they've never had a chance to be heard and they've never had a chance to really share their thinking. And it's quite a humbling, but it's also quite a sad situation very often, isn't it? So I think sometimes there's a gap between what we want the practice to be and what it maybe needs, you know, to get people there. And I guess I'm interested in schooling particularly, and I know we've got some teachers in the room tonight. And often when I was wanting to work with a thinking environment in my own teaching, I was told by other teachers, it doesn't work in schools, you know, it's not going to work here. It's not something you can do in this kind of a classroom because we've got this lesson plan and we've got to get through all of this content. So when I think about fascist education at the moment, and I'm not going to say, yes, our schools are fascist, but I think that if we look for these fascist patterns and particularly control over the curriculum, which is a big issue at the moment, I think that's a real issue in schools, particularly around these issues of obedience and uniformity and those kind of things. So I'm interested to know what you might say to people who are thinking, how might I work with this as a teacher in a normal classroom in a school in the UK? What might I do to try and bring those values into that setting?
It is, there's two things that immediately come to mind. One is that love of power. And if anyone listening is thinking my initial response is, we can't do that here, just check in with yourself that that's not about love of power, because, and that's not a criticism, because I have loved power as a teacher and I have gone through, and we've talked about this, a whole, you know, journey of wanting power but not recognizing I wanted power, and then wanting to be liked but not recognizing I want to be liked, and all of that stuff. Working with adults, of course, but scrutinize that first, and that's maybe the first step. And the second step, absolutely, to acknowledge when we think about, you know, that statement, the first thing fascist control sees is the curriculum. I can remember being for the first time with UK at Utrecht University, where we went every year, you know, for many years. I know you're still involved with that. And Rosie Braidotti, who led that summer school, saying that. And I remember thinking at the time that was about content. And I imagined, you know, Chinese children during the Cultural Revolution and Soviet children. But actually, one way of seizing the curriculum is by making it so busy that it's impossible to do any thinking. And that is true of schools. It's true of FE as well. I think it's true of universities. So I despair. Friends often come to me and ask for, you know, help with essays and stuff. They're told what to read, you know, telling people what to read. Oh, I've got to mention all of these texts. So you're not learning to study. You're not finding things out for yourself. And that's all about that control of the curriculum. How to make a start. The first step, I think, is the humanizing potential of checking in and checking out. Beginning that culture, which you can do with from early years, beginning that culture of not interrupting. It will take time. It's very hard. And what teachers often say is, oh, well, I tried that and it doesn't work. It will never work the first. It's always chaos the first time. Peter Shuke's here, and he was probably in the classroom when I worked with a group of students at Blackburn College, and we did an opening round. And these were adult students on a degree. We did an opening round, and literally nobody spoke. And I think you've had that experience as well. But something you taught me, Kay, is I was going through a phase of, I'd experienced this resistance within the organisation and externally. And I was going through a phase of, I suppose, capitalising up the language I used. And I was starting to use language about efficiency because it's a very efficient process. And you were working, you were in teacher training, and you were hearing feedback from students who had used the thinking environment with lads in particular, who came from perhaps backgrounds where there wasn't a lot of love, and were using language of feelings and affective language in the classroom. And these boys were just soaking it up. And that totally stopped me in my tracks and took me back to the values of it. What's happening in FE, and again, I don't think this can, I think this can happen at any age, is that once educators buy in, and that takes a while, then they get it. And then they will find ways of perhaps doing thinking pairs work, which doesn't take a lot of time. And I think digital also allows us ways, particularly with older kids and with adults, of actually getting the content over, perhaps in a digital space, and then actually, as we did at Northern College, using the face-to-face time you have together to start unpicking and exploring. And once people are connected to their values, it's hard to go wrong with that, really.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wondered if we could say a little bit more about power, because it really interests me. And I'm just going to quote from Foucault. Sorry, Foucault, you know, problematic character, probably always, but especially at the moment. But the quote I think that I find really useful is this, and it's the strategic adversary is fascism, the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behaviour, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. And you alluded a little bit earlier to that, your own, you know, experience of that and how it feels. And I think this is something that we don't reflect on very much as teachers. And I don't ever particularly remember in teacher education it coming up. It might have done on our courses, but not generally speaking. But this idea about how it feels to hold power. So as a teacher, it's such a powerful position to be in. You know, we can't underestimate that. And I know we have trainees in the room tonight, but very rarely do we talk about not just what it does, but how it feels to hold it and how it feels to enact it. And I think as a parent as well, that's a similar kind of experience. And sometimes you'll experience that buzz or that sudden, you know, rush of holding power, which for many people, I'm sure, can be quite sort of addictive in a way. And I think I'm just interested, I suppose, to know from your point of view how you get people to a point where they're willing to maybe recognise or notice that, and then what you do with that noticing.
It's interesting that Mike Chitty has just posted in the chat that he works with medics and clinicians a lot, and trying to get them to have the discipline of even a short thinking pair is so hard for them. And that's power. That's about power. It's not hard for them because they lack attention. It's hard for them because they don't see the value of listening to someone else and the discipline of the process. So one of the things I think I should say is that it is a bit of an all or nothing. I don't mean you have to be in a thinking environment all the time, but when you're in it, you have to do it properly and with discipline and with patience. Sometimes an explicit question is helpful. So I can remember working with a group of advanced practitioners, and it's in, I've written about it in one of the collective ed working papers I've shared in the chat. And an opening round question I asked them was, where in your practice do you feel most powerful and why? And some people found that very, very difficult to answer because they were in denial about the power they held as teachers. And I hadn't planned this, but after one particularly challenging round, and people were just like, no, I don't have any power. And then they were talking about, because all my power is taken away from me within the organization, which we experience as teachers. It's hard to get us to feel we have power. I drew on the notion which comes from Spinoza. So it's part of this whole genealogy of post-human thinking that you and I have studied for a long time. And he, writing in Latin in the 17th century, he had two words for power at his disposal. One was potestas, which is power as usual, what we think of as power, political, hierarchical power. And the other was potentia. Barbara, you'll recognize this with your community work. That's activist power. That is a different sort of energy. It's an energy which can be shared. And actually, that's what, when I brought potestas and potentia into my teaching on a real regular basis, when I'm teaching people the thinking environment, because people get that. And for teachers working in really oppressive situations, that sense of having a bit of potential wriggle room. Where is your potential? Have you got none? Well, you know, I might have a little bit, or I might have a little bit of influence here. Working with the Women's Leadership Network recently, we talked about it in terms of potestas being status and potentia being influence. And that was quite helpful as well. And I think these are, you know, these are anti-fragile practices for uncertain times, when our traditional modes of leadership are just not fit for purpose now, because life is so complex. That potential leadership is something which I think has got a great deal of, well, potential really for the times that we're in. So so that is really helpful to get people thinking. And then actually a step from thinking about potential, and actually I do have a bit of clout here. I've got some potestas in that meeting that I go in. People then can find an easier way into perhaps climbing down from their own power. One of the things that we're able to challenge quite a lot in a thinking environment is the language that people use. So some people will start laughing now because I bang on about this endlessly. But, you know, in FE, there's a lot of talk of my learners. And I find that a really patronizing term. I know you don't mean it. I know you mean it from a practice of care, but where's the equality in that? That sort of possessive. So even shifting away from that in their practice, educators have come back to me and said, actually, that's really flipped a switch. And now I'm thinking about other ways in which I'm using language to unintentionally communicate my potestas, my power, and to, you know, create an inequality.
I think those concepts are so helpful, aren't they? And we were talking actually in class earlier, not with my students, but with the students, about how, you know, we have a kind of paucity of language to describe things. I think that the English language doesn't always give us the range, you know, that we need, and the kind of concepts that like that you can actually put to work that are really, really helpful. And so to be able to reflect on your own power and start to think about how it feels, you know, there's a question I think that I put in the blog, you know, what experience do I have of oppressing others? You know, those are really difficult things to ask yourself, aren't they? But they're really important. And just before we move on from power, 'cause I'm getting a bit stuck because it's so interesting, but I suppose one of the challenges as well for me as a teacher is this idea of attachment and becoming attached to certain aspects of practice. And I'm interested to know, for someone who's obviously worked with the thinking environment for such a long time, is there a danger, do you think, for us sometimes to get so attached to a particular way of working that almost becomes a micro-fascism, that we think everything has to be done like this? I'm not saying you do, but I think in my own practice, I have certain things that I hang on to because they feel possibly safe. Perhaps I feel a little bit of power through knowledge, actually, because I know it's something that I know really well. And I'm wondering how we can remain open, I suppose, to that and not become too fascistic about our own practice.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's about, when you're doing a thing, doing it properly. Like I love a really good lecture. I really love a lecture. I love to sit beside someone when we're learning to do a skill together and to be just chatting. I love to read a book. You know, there are so many different ways. And I tend to think now of pedagogy in terms of texture. And, you know, how can we've got an hour and a half, say, how can we make sure that, that there are lots of different textures in here, and particularly in teaching online, how can we make sure that we're doing things in other spaces that are asynchronous, or people can go and maybe listen to a podcast and have a cup of tea or something like that. There's something, the thinking environment then becomes the thing which creates a better culture for that stuff as well. So one of the things I've noticed in the past year there's a big professional development program I've been working on called AP Connect. We brought people together at the start of the project, and I would say about a third of the people in the room were also trying to teach or be in a staff meeting or check their emails. That continuous partial attention that the organisation was laying on them, but also they thought was normal and okay. If I can do all of these things, it's okay. And actually, the difference when we got them back together in January was humbling, and people were so open because they had experienced the power of properly being listened to, and they wanted to do that then to others. So there's something about perhaps being immersed in a thinking environment that starts to create a culture, and then you can open up into all sorts of other different things, but people understand the value of attention. And one of the things I've really noticed this year is educators saying, I'm not going to come to that, Lou, because I know I can't give it my full attention. That is brilliant. That is brilliant. Part of what we are burdened with is all of this noise of stuff. And actually the quietness and the slow ontology, as Jasmine Ulmer would call it, of being maybe this thinking environment wraparound helps us see where other things could maybe be improved for attention-wise, if that makes sense. The attention is really everything, but we can only do that in shortish bursts.
I love the idea of texture. That's a lovely way to put it. Yeah, that's really nice. I wanted to ask you a bit about this idea of difference and uniformity. So, as I said at the start, you know, one of the fascist patterns, if you like, is the dislike of difference. Well, you know, more than dislike, and a kind of striving for uniformity. And I think everyone who follows me on Twitter knows my bugbear about school uniform, and I know it's a massive can of worms, so I'm not going to open it up tonight. But I have seen, and I don't think anyone can really argue, that over the last few years, certainly with the rise of academy trusts, there has been this huge driver around uniformity of dress and the kind of really heightened internal exclusion, external exclusion as well, for people who infringe those regulations. There was a story today, just today actually, about a girl in year 7 who was internally excluded for wearing the wrong kind of skirt or something like that, an 11-year-old child. I just said I wasn't going to go on about uniform. About uniform. But no, so difference and uniformity, the thinking environment, and there's the classic phrase that I use all the time in my teaching, be present as yourself. And that's one of the cornerstones, isn't it? It's one of the key concepts of the thinking environment. So show up as you, be present as yourself. It's you that we need. And I'm interested in how that for you relates to anti-fascist pedagogy and what difference might mean in a thinking environment. And I know that Nancy Kline has moved away from diversity to thinking more about difference in itself and for itself. So could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, I will. Diversity has always been one of the 10 components of a thinking environment, and there's actually an application, a process of the thinking environment called the diversity process, which Jo Fletcher-Saxon, you will remember from years ago. But in her recent book and in her recent work, Nancy has shifted to this word difference in order to do some disentangling from identity politics. Because what's happening is, of course, we're all becoming more and more atomized into, you know, groupings, whether we project that on ourselves or others project that on us. And uniform, and in fact fashion more generally, I think, and the sort of uniformity of look and is really part of that process. And I, having said to Barbara in the chat early on that we might not cover post-human stuff particularly, I'm going to bring in the post-human concept of Vitruvian man here, because I think that's a really powerful way to look at difference. And I'm learning, I'm learning all the time. But if you picture Leonardo's, Renaissance man with the sort of sticky out arms and legs, he became a figure in the Enlightenment that came to represent the perfect human. And that seems innocent until you start thinking about all of those of us who are never going to measure up to that David Beckham figure. So, we might be able to, as Enlightenment thinkers, thought, well, you can get an education, yeah, but I can't educate myself out of, like, to make myself more white, nor should I. Can't educate myself to make myself more male, why should I? More able-bodied. Simone Bignell, who's an Australian thinker, she says that the further we are away from that Vitruvian ideal, the closer we are to death, is actually what she said. Our lives become more precarious in this global environment. So difference becomes a weapon. It's weaponized. And I've just been reading this fabulous book that I knew I would want to recommend to everybody at some point. If you've not read it already, it's Emma DeBerry's book, What White People Can Do Next. It's only £7. It's hilarious, actually, laugh out loud in some ways. And then in other ways, your breath will stop. But she talks about how whiteness, even whiteness, is a construct. Whiteness was never a thing when the solidarity was between black and white workers. Whiteness had to be brought in order to make the white workers, and we're talking about, the colonizing American South, make the white workers identify with the white slave owners in order to break up that solidarity. And then that, that stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? And it makes me certainly think about difference as weaponized. So holding a space in a thinking environment where you are invited to be present as yourself in all of your identities, and we all have, up to 20 of them, where that's okay. And that might manifest in your kids coming on the screen or, in all sorts of different ways. You don't have to list them all. Is really powerful, but it also needs to be accompanied by, and we're on a longer journey with this, it needs to be accompanied by, where are the absent voices then? And the example that I always used to give, and you'll remember in my teaching, Kay, was I used to teach on courses where parenting workers would come, parent support workers, almost all women, and they would talk about mums. It was always mums. There were no dads, So, that's just one example. Difference is so weaponized now that the spaces where we can find the commonalities become increasingly rare and precious, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have a bit of an issue around the word inclusion on a similar note, actually, because I think the question for me is always including in what, and including people, it's like inviting someone and the table's already been set, the environment's already been created, and we might make some adjustments, but we're not going to dismantle the structure that's already been designed for the status quo or designed for some kind of normative human. We might include you in that, thank you very much, be grateful, but we're not going to change the heart of it. We're always adapting it. So I think this idea of going to the point of difference really interests me, echoed in the post-human concept of becoming minoritarian, which is where, becoming minor, not meaning lesser, but the minoritized, so people who have been made the minority, but are probably actually the majority. So going to the point of difference really, I think is something that we need to think more about. And I'm particularly interested in that in terms of neurodiversity, because I think, in terms of our teaching practice and all of those things, that point of difference hasn't really been properly explored, and causes a huge amount of damage. And I don't know if you want to say any more about that, maybe from your own experience, and how the thinking environment can open up space for those kinds of difference as well.
Yes, absolutely. And for the last year, who are we is a big question in post-human thinking, to always question who the we is, who the what is it that people, whose what is it that people are being excluded from, who sets those parameters is really massive. Same in community work, where, you know, I thought we used to talk about hard to reach people. Apparently that's still talked about. So nonsense. Disowned people is more like it. So I think that construction of we is really important. And we, as a collective of educators who came together in lockdown, that I'm talking about now, is Joy FE. So just a collective, just a movement, just a hashtag, not an organisation, not anything, no management, no hierarchy, no money. And we run twice a week ideas rooms, which is a thinking environment space where people come into to explore their own ideas. And neurodiversity is so big in that space. It's absolutely wonderful that there's something about the quietness and ease that enables people to be there as themselves and then start thinking about all the other spaces where it's not okay. Because I think as non-neurotypical people, and I am one, I've got, my wiring is ADHD wiring, I was forever not fitting in. I was too noisy, or I was too quiet, or I was too interrupty, or I was too bouncy, or I was too much, all of this stuff. And the thinking environment is like a great big sigh for me and for other neuroatypical people that I have spoken to. A great big sigh where you can gather your scattered thoughts or whatever, and you can talk about your thing. And then in doing that, you then move into being in a space where you've got an idea to do something about your thing, and then you do the thing. So we have podcasts and blogs now, and so much of a presence. Are we talking about neurodiversity rather than inclusion? And it's just that, I think it's the quietness of that thinking space, because the last place you need to be, if you are not fitting into what appears to be the norm for everybody else, is a noisy, busy space where you forget who you are, and it's easier just to try and fit in. And then, of course, the shame and blame cycle that comes with all of the not fitting in. So I think it's been a very powerful, I hear those voices really coming through the thinking environment spaces that I've been involved in this year.
Mm-hmm. I think just that phrase, be present as yourself, I would just love to see that, you know, running through education, because we don't ask people to be present as themselves, do we? We ask people to be a certain type of person, generally speaking, I think. So there's something really liberating about that. And yeah, in terms of anti-fascist practice, to turn to difference, I think is really key to all of this.
I love that phrase, turn to difference, actually. That's beautiful. Yes.
It's nice, isn't it? I was trying to think, I've been challenged on inclusion. I work with a lot of people who have inclusion in their job titles, or, you know, really passionate about inclusion. So I don't ever want to dismiss the work, because it's important on so many levels. And then they'll say, well, what word would you use instead? And I'll say, becoming minoritarian. And they like look at me like, don't think that's going to work, Kay, is it? So the turn to difference is the closest I've come so far. And it's like, there isn't the language, is there? This is, again, we're up against a limit in terms of the language that is there. And so maybe it's time to invent some new terms, I think, for this stuff, you know, in order to dismantle those monuments, you know, those documents of the kind of world as it has been. Yeah. We're coming up to 10:02, and I don't know whether people wanted to ask some questions, certainly of Lou, but maybe post things in the chat. I've probably missed lots as I've been going through, so do feel free to post them in again, and we'll have a moment just to pick up on the comments. Lou, is there anything else that you wanted to add in terms of your own thinking from tonight?
Yeah, I think there is, and I am still struggling to articulate this, so bear with me if what I'm going to say is clumsy. It's not meant in any blaming or judgmental way. By being critical thinkers, we often get really stuck in saying what we already know. And there's always a place for that. But I think sometimes we do not move on from the stuff we know about the oppressive organizations and societies that we live and work in. And I would like to see more of a balance. And I think what the thinking environment spaces that we're opening up through Joy FE are providing an opportunity for is for people to come in knowing, being critical, but not bringing their cynicism in with them, in order to be able to create conditions in their own work that also in turn promote independent thinking. And we've learned so much over the last year about what Erin Manning calls the minor gesture. It is those tiny things, the remembering people's name, the relational practice, the asking how are you and listening for an answer instead of rushing into the busy, that are creating spaces to think. So, the voices that are sometimes heard, and I would say particularly on the left, are the same critiques over and over and over with an element of cynicism. That's not my work. That's absolutely not my work. I'm not saying it shouldn't be other people's, but maybe there are some of us, but I used to be that person as well. So maybe there are some of us who could balance the books a little bit. Yes, still critique, but you're critiquing always against the status quo. That's what critique is. What about finding new things? And you'll only find new things if you create the spaces to think them. And I think that's where I'd like to leave it tonight.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm just looking at the chat. Erin Manning, yes, that is right, Kate. Definitely look up her work. There's a beautiful piece. I'm struggling to share in the chat, but I'll share it on Twitter afterwards, which is, you know, a lot of her work is beautiful, but there's a really lovely piece that I'll share later. Teachers of Tomorrow, so our podcasters have got a question. Lou, around power. So could power be misconstrued as responsibility? Also, does power have to be negative if you're in a position of power but aware of issues like fascism that allows you to influence real change?
Yes, I think, again, returning you to this idea of potestas and potentia. Kay and I worked at Northern College, which is a college that came out of the trade union and labour movement. And when I first went there, it had been open maybe 20 years, and it was still very much, there was a lot of talk of fascism, but you were still being told how to think in many of the sessions there. So you could be in a position of potestas, have status, and still be in danger of imposing your views on others, because they will hold it together in the classroom, but they might talk something very different in the dinner queue, as we found. So there's something about, even in a position of status, and I'm not saying power's wrong. I am a very powerful person. I know that. I'm a potential person, but I know where I have clout and I use my clout. Rosie Braidotti says a good career is 2/3 potestas and 1/3 potentia. That's what Kay does in her career. In my career as a nomad, as a freelancer, maybe 2/3 potential, 1/3 potestas. So I think that might speak to your question. And could power be misconstrued as responsibility? Yes, of course. And sharing responsibility, whilst also sharing that in an equitable manner, so that people are genuinely recognised for what they do and appreciated for who they are. That distribution of responsibility, I think, is a powerful move. We run Joy FE as a collective. That ain't easy. That involves a lot of thinking space to understand how 20 odd people and growing can push a movement without falling back into traditional potestas power. And one of the hardest things about that for me has been the person who is perceived as having power, and actually it's not me distributing it, it's people receiving the potential. Does that make sense? So, you know, we're trying to work in a really different model here, and we're starting to articulate what that is and how that can perhaps influence some of the ways in which organizations work.
I just wanted to pick up quickly on the nomad idea, because when you were talking about the balance of potestas and potentia, and as you said, I obviously work for an organisation, so I'm steeped in the potestas kind of power. But I think this idea of being nomad or nomadic in your way of being or your way of feeling your way through the world really interests me, and this idea of attachment. And I think a lot of organisations set a lot of store by loyalty, and there's lots of talk of loyalty. Certainly in my career, there's been you know, great shock. Are you leaving us? You know what I mean? We gave you this job, how could you do that? And we're kind of forced to attach ourselves to institutions that quite frankly don't love us back. You know, it's not a healthy relationship. So I'm interested, I think certainly in terms of sort of anti-fascist practice, that idea of kind of detachment, not from people, but from, you know, that kind of bureaucratic institutional power to somehow not be, you know, constrained within our minds to have that attachment to organisations. And is that what you think of in terms of being nomadic?
Yes, absolutely. So nomadic means being guided by a personal ethics, and that is, Joe, would you, if you could very quickly post my TED talk into the chat, because I think that probably gets it over better, because I'm rushing and I might get tongue tied. But being guided by a personal ethics, which is not what your church says, what your family says, what your organization's code of conduct is, what the professional standards are, but finding your own professionalism within that is nomadic. And Kay, you and I have written about the work being the organization. What is your work? My work fundamentally is the pursuit of equality, and it plays out in different ways. And that is my organization. And Joy FE is one part of that. The stuff I get paid for is a part of that. But the organization, once the organization starts being the work, you're institutionalized, and then it is really, really difficult for that not to get into your head, I think.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, quite challenging again to kind of push against, because we're not conditioned, I think, to think like that. You know, that idea of gratitude is really deep within us, I think, particularly depending on our background and, you know, our need to work and all of that. And to be grateful is something I think we often feel, you know, very beholden to that. Lou, we've got coming up to the end now, aren't we? We've got a couple of minutes to go. I was going to do a quick shout out before we finish. We've set up a Discord channel. Is that the word? A Discord server, that's it, to discuss anti-fascist education in more detail. We've just got going. There's quite a few of us there already, but I'm hoping over the coming months that we can perhaps do some writing together, certainly some reading, more sessions like this. We've got people from all over the world in that group with all kinds of interesting experiences to share of being within anti-fascist spaces. So if you do want to join, do contact myself or Lou. We can give you the link. There's no pressure with it. It's a slow movement. If a month goes by and you haven't posted anything, you know, it's absolutely fine. There's no burden to contribute. You're very welcome to dip in and out. So yes, do ask us for the link for that. And I think there's just one last quick question again from Teachers of Tomorrow. How do you stay neutral and create an environment without influence? Being a nomad, which is a good question for you, Lou. I would have thought that being a nomad meant your beliefs and values would be at the forefront of what you do. Yeah, totally. They're on the tin. So people don't come to me for, they've learned not to come to me for how can I get outstanding at Ofsted anymore. So they're on the tin, and I choose a piece of work based on whether it matches my values. I'm very open about that. But then when I create the spaces, people find their own way
within that. And so there's something about openness, and I don't do that, I should say, from a position of any particular economic privilege. Not at all. I've been, I've managed to find my way without too much anxiety around that. Can I do a very quick shout out for the Ideas Rooms, Kay? Because it's the very best way to experience a thinking environment for the first time. All you need to do is come prepared to just listen. So every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and every Friday at 9 a.m. they're on Zoom. And if you just tweet me at Lou Mycroft, or you can find me easily Google-wise, I'll send you the link.
So that's our hour. Thanks ever so much, everybody, for your brilliant comments. I'm hoping I can read back through these after we finish, because lots of things I want to pick up on. We can carry on with the hashtag on Twitter, Posthuman Pedagogies, talking on there. Again, do message us for the link for Discord, and we can, hopefully make some real change around all of these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kay, and thanks everybody for coming. Have a great evening. Bye.
Bye.